Speaker, I am struck today by the importance of this moment and also by the immense responsibility that we hold as members of Parliament. As people across the country deal with the impacts of a global pandemic, we are tasked with creating the laws that will best help them in challenges that they face, that will keep them safe and healthy, that will provide the support that they need. And in this already unparalleled moment in our history, on top of everything else, we have witnessed the occupation of our nation's capital. And we are now tasked in this debate with examining and deciding on the use for the first time ever of the Emergencies Act. This is not a moment that any of us should take lightly. And for me, as someone who came to this role through community activism, attending countless protests, standing in front of trucks filled with contaminated soil, delivering food to tree sitters, protecting fragile ecosystems, organizing climate demonstrations, protest, dissent, and social movements are vital elements of our democracy. And we need to ensure that nonviolent civil disobedience remains a protected and valued part of our society. We also need to ensure there is effective oversight to any additional powers given to government. The Emergency Act itself has provisions that require, after the emergency is over, an inquiry into the circumstances under which the declaration was issued and into the measures taken. This should also include a public inquiry into the role of law enforcement in these occupations, the reports of officers supporting the occupiers and police refusing to enforce the law. It is clear there needs to be a sober examination of policing in Canada. The difference between how occupiers were treated by police versus how Indigenous and racialized people have been treated is stark. This disparity is unjust, and it also undermines Canadians' trust in law enforcement. I have been contacted by many people who are concerned about the use of the Emergencies Act, many who are concerned that we should not set a precedent of cracking down on protests. So it's important to note that what we've seen over the past 24 days has not just been a protest. It has not been peaceful. And the core organizers of this occupation were very clear from the outset that their goal was to overthrow a democratically elected government. And when I first read their aims, I have to admit I laughed. I think, like most Canadians, to me, it sounded preposterous. They couldn't seriously think that the Governor General and the Senate could just remove the Prime Minister, or that it would be possible in Canada to hand over power to an unelected group of occupiers. But these organizers, many of them well-known far-right figures who have espoused Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Indigenous, and other hateful views, published their goals to take down the government in a manifesto. To quote Maya Angelou, "When people tell you who they are, believe them." This illegal occupation raised millions of dollars, had significant foreign involvement, was explicit in its goal to undermine our democracy. We've also witnessed instances of organized militia-style activity, weapons seized, body armor with white supremacist insignia, thousands of rounds of ammunition. In January, the convoy as they initially rolled across the country, there were convoy supporters who went on TV saying, "We've got guns, we'll stand up and we'll bring them out." When people tell you who they are, believe them. And while all of this was happening, we had a number of Conservative MPs welcoming the convoy to the city, handing out donuts, making excuses for the deplorable actions at memorials, encouraging them to stay. The member from Carleton saying he was proud of the convoy, that he stands with them. Convoy participants occupied the city, made it unbearable for residents. They harassed journalists, they harassed healthcare workers. There are reports of attempted arson, bomb threats to hospitals, plans to block airports and railways. Our borders were shut down, weapons were seized, attempted murder charges laid. And the member from Carleton, who wants to be the Prime Minister of Canada, stands with them. When people tell you who they are, believe them. But if these Conservative members truly stood with truckers, they would stand with the 90% of truckers who got vaccinated, with the truckers who have been profoundly negatively impacted by border blockades. They would listen to the Canadian Truckers Alliance, who put out a statement saying they applaud the use of the Emergencies Act to help end the illegal blockades. In those initial weeks, while Conservative MPs encouraged the occupiers, the Liberal government stood idly by. As the convoy rolled across towards Ottawa, as the far-right rhetoric rose in the truck convoy, as foreign funding poured into a movement that aimed to undermine our democracy, the government did nothing. It should never have come to this. The use of the Emergencies Act is an acknowledgement of a failure of leadership. Governments allowed things to escalate unchecked and could have addressed this crisis early on, but they failed to. After over 2 weeks of turmoil and chaos, the Ottawa Police Services Board chair stated, and I quote, "Frankly, the response to this crisis so far has been ineffective." She said, "Police have been," and I quote again, "unable to adequately enforce our laws, and our residents continue to be terrorized." In this debate, we are being asked whether the Emergencies Act was necessary. It has been clear that for the past 3 weeks, that the municipality, that a number of provinces were not able to maintain security in our nation's capital and at our borders. This is one of the key reasons why the situation meets the definition of a national emergency under Section 3 of the Act. Once the Emergencies Act was enacted, the interim Ottawa police chief made it clear that without these additional powers, they would not have been able to make the progress they made. Over the past week, we finally saw police taking appropriate and measured steps to remove the occupiers. The Act allowed RCMP to direct tow truck drivers to tow vehicles. In addition, without the Emergencies Act, the RCMP and financial institutions could not quickly freeze funds that were fundraised with the explicit intent to destabilize our elected government. And we know that there has been significant foreign funding. When the Convoy's GoFundMe was shut down, they started using Give, Send, Go, a Christian platform infamously known for being the platform used by many of the groups involved in the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Also for raising millions for the Proud Boys, a listed terrorist entity in Canada. A recent data leak identifying Give, Send, Go's donors to the Convoy campaign showed that over half of the donors were from the US and less than a third of the donors were Canadian. The Emergencies Act also gives the power to prohibit bringing children to unlawful assemblies. Many of us watched in horror as occupiers brought their children to block the border crossing. And then we heard reports of occupiers keeping their kids near the police line, using them as shields. As a parent, it is hard to wrap my head around the choice to bring children into such dangerous situations. The powers granted by the Emergencies Act were needed as they did help secure our national capital. Yesterday, the occupation was still happening, and there were still border closures happening in Surrey because of the convoy protests. But today, things are quieter, and New Democrats have been clear that we are ready to withdraw our support at any time if needed. If the situation is actually under control, then the government has to provide a compelling reason for why they still need their emergency powers. If there isn't one, then we've said all along that we'd withdraw support. We've heard again and again comparisons to the War Measures Act, but we know that this is not the same law. It's not even close. Under the War Measures Act, there is no constitution, no Bill of Rights, no provincial constitutions. The government would have the power to do anything it wants, to intern citizens, to deport any citizen, to arrest any person. We can all agree that that is unacceptable, and it's why Tommy Douglas and other New Democrats voted against it. The War Measures Act suspended the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's why in 1988, the act was repealed. The Emergencies Act, the act that replaced it, is subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is subject to the Canadian Bill of Rights. Now, there is still a valid concern that the government could misuse the powers in the Emergencies Act. And this is why New Democrats have been clear that if we vote in favor of the government's request, the government must stay within the established powers, or we will withdraw support. We will protect the right to protest. We must continue to hold dissent and nonviolent civil disobedience as sacred, as integral parts of our democracy. And I want to close my speech by speaking through you, Mr. Speaker, to the vast majority of Canadians who have been following public health orders, who banged pots to show support for healthcare workers, who've been helping out their neighbors, who've made great sacrifices in order to keep their loved ones, their families, and their communities safe. As mandates and restrictions begin to lift, know that it's because of your acts of solidarity. The fact that you got vaccinated, and the convoy participants, while they might not realize it, they owe you a great debt of gratitude. You not only saved lives, but you're the reason we're going to get through this together. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Kings Hants.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from Victoria for her remarks. She wasn't wrong when she's talking about the gravity of what we're debating today, and ultimately, on future legal tests, jurists will look back to our words here on Hansard that can help understand why the precedent was set. And my rationale is not unlike hers, which is the national capital being occupied, the fact that individuals had talked about overthrowing a democratically elected government, not everyone, but certainly some of the core group that was involved, the economic harm that was associated with it, the fact that members have talked about reestablishing blockades, and the fact that there's been this level of foreign funding, and to really focus on the disruption of critical infrastructure. I support those limited tools. Of course, some conservatives are trying to make parallels to Wet'suwet'en and some of the blockades we've seen. To me, there doesn't give the same level of rise because there was not a threat to the democratic overthrow of the government. There was not the same level of foreign financing. And it was certainly clear that that could be addressed at the municipal and provincial level. Could the member opine to give those that might look back on this time a legal precedent of whether or not she would agree with those principles of why this is being established?
Honourable member for Victoria.
I want to thank the member for his question, and I agree that in this case, we are talking about people who were explicit in their intention to undermine our democracy. And over the past few weeks, we have seen assaults, attempted arson, widespread harassment of homes and workplaces, promotion of hate, and then also convoy members giving themselves false powers to detain people, deputizing themselves. And rather than denounce those actions and find ways to help Canadians who don't feel safe in their homes, Conservatives have been spending all of their time defending and fueling this. This is shameful, but it's also shameful that it took this long for the government to act. And
question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Regina, Wascana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the honourable member really believe that the trucker convoy is going to overthrow the federal government? And if so, how?
Well, member for Victoria.
I want to thank the member for his question. And I think it is deeply concerning when a group of people espouse white supremacist, hateful, Islamophobic rhetoric, that they explicitly publish a manifesto that declares their intention to undermine our democracy. They fundraise millions of dollars. The majority of that coming from donors from outside of our country. It is deeply concerning. The fact that this member rises without that same concern is troubling. Thank you, Mr.
A commentaire, questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my colleague for her speech. I was pleasantly surprised that she wasn't absolutely clear that she would support the Liberal Party in the invocation of this act. She had certain things that she wanted. I'd like to know, at this moment where the blockades have been dismantled and the city of Ottawa has been freed, practically freed, does she think that this act is still helpful, necessary, and indispensable?
I want to thank the member for her question. And we have been clear from the outset. New Democrats believe that this is a national emergency, that it was absolutely warranted to invoke the Emergencies Act, and that at any point when it is no longer necessary, or if the government overreaches, that we will withdraw our support. And so it is really incumbent on the Liberal government to demonstrate clearly why these powers are still necessary.